300 tons, 60 horses, one machine. In 1901, a steam-powered contraption weighing 20 tons crawled out of a blacksmith shop in Waterville, Maine, and changed the world. It had skis on the front like a sleigh. It had a boiler that burned 4 cords of wood per day. And on the back, it had something no one had ever seen before: a continuous metal track that gripped snow and ice like nothing else in existence. That machine replaced 60 horses. It hauled loads those horses couldn't dream of moving, and it did it through 4 feet of Maine snow in temperatures that froze men's fingers black on winter nights so cold that steam turned to ice before it hit the ground. The man who built it was named Alvin Orlando Lombard. He was a blacksmith. He had never seen a tractor. He had never been to engineering school. He had never read a textbook on vehicle design. He just watched horses die in the Maine woods, 12, 15, and 18 horses per season at $100 each, and decided there had to be a better way. What he invented in that blacksmith shop didn't just solve the logging industry's problem. It created the technology that would later power every tank in World War I, every bulldozer that ever moved earth, every Caterpillar tractor that ever crawled across a construction site. The continuous track, the single most important innovation in off-road vehicle history, came from a Maine blacksmith who needed to haul logs through blizzards. But here's the thing about Alvin Lombard: almost nobody remembers him. The companies that licensed his patents became household names. The machines that copied his design conquered continents. And the man himself died in relative obscurity, his contribution to history buried under the snow he'd spent his life learning to conquer. This is the story of the Lombard log hauler, the first tracked vehicle ever patented, the machine that replaced 60 horses, and the forgotten inventor whose idea quite literally drives the modern world. But to understand what Lombard built, you need to understand what he was up against. Maine in winter wasn't logging country. It was a frozen hell that happened to contain trees worth money. The snow started falling in November and didn't stop until April. 4 feet was normal. 6 feet wasn't unusual. In bad years, drifts piled 10 or 12 feet deep in the hollows, and the forest became white mazes where a man could walk past a cabin without seeing it. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, 40 below. Cold so intense that metal became brittle and shattered under stress. Cold that froze the moisture in a man's lungs and killed him from the inside out. A logger named Patrick Mulroney supposedly stepped outside a bunkhouse in January of 1894 to relieve himself, and was found the next morning frozen solid, not 20 feet from the door. This was the environment where the timber industry had to operate, and they had to operate in winter because summer made the work impossible for different reasons. In summer, the ground was mud, endless, sucking, bottomless mud that swallowed horses to their bellies and wagons to their axles. Logs that weighed 2 tons couldn't be moved through muck like that. The swamps bred mosquitoes in clouds so thick they drove animals insane. The rivers ran too low to float timber to the mills. Winter was the only option. When the ground froze solid, you could build ice roads, packed snow surfaces flooded with water that froze into sheets hard enough to slide massive loads across. When the rivers iced over, you could stage logs on the banks for spring drives. Winter was brutal and deadly and horrible, but winter was when the work got done, and the work required horses. Thousands of horses. A single logging operation might run 200 horses in a season. Teams of 8 or 10 pulled sleds stacked with logs down ice roads to the river landings. The horses worked in shifts, resting and eating while other teams hauled. Cycling through the brutal cold in rotations that never stopped. But the horses died. God. How they died. The cold killed them. Horses couldn't survive extended exposure to 40 below zero. Their lungs froze. Their hearts gave out. They collapsed in harness and had to be dragged off the road so the next team could pass. The work killed them. Hauling loads, up grades too steep for the ice roads, broke their legs, their backs, their spirits. A horse that slipped on ice and went down under a loaded sled didn't get up again. The runners crushed whatever the fall didn't. The conditions killed them. Horses need water. But water froze solid in minutes at those temperatures. Horses need food, but hauling enough grain and hay into remote logging camps was itself a massive logistical challenge. Horses need rest, but the timber barons needed production, and production meant pushing the animals past their limits. A camp boss named Everett Stone kept records for the Great Northern Paper Company operation near Moosehead Lake. His ledgers, preserved in the Maine State Archives, show the cost in animal flesh. See winter of 1896 to 97, 16 horses dead at an average cost of $95 each. Total loss, $1,500, in an era when a working man earned $1 a day. Winter of 1897 to 98, 14 horses dead. Winter of 1898 to 99, 18 horses dead. Winter of 1899 to 1900, 21 horses dead, the worst season in Stone's tenure. The ice roads were particularly treacherous that year, and 3 teams went through weak spots on river crossings, drowning horses and losing loads. The economics were brutal. Every dead horse was $100 gone. Every day without horses was a day without production. Every spring, the camps had to buy new animals to replace the ones the winter had consumed. And there was a limit to what horses could do, no matter how many of them you used. A team of 10 horses, working in perfect conditions on a perfect ice road, could haul maybe 30 tons of logs. But the grades weren't always perfect. The conditions were never perfect. In reality, 20 tons was a good load. The timber barons wanted more. The mills downstream were hungry. The markets were expanding. If only there were a way to haul bigger loads. Haul them faster. Haul them without killing a fortune in horseflesh every season. This was the problem that sat in the mind of Alvin Orlando Lombard while he worked his forge in Waterville. Now let me tell you about the man who solved it. Alvin Orlando Lombard was born in 1856 in Springfield, Maine, like the son of a farmer and part-time mechanic. His formal education ended around 8th grade. What he knew about engineering, he taught himself, watching machines, taking them apart, understanding how the pieces fit together. By his 30s, he'd established himself as one of the best blacksmiths in central Maine. His shop in Waterville did work for the logging industry, repairing equipment, fabricating parts, and solving the mechanical problems that arose when you tried to harvest timber in conditions that destroyed machinery. Lombard understood the logging business. He'd watched the operations, talked to the camp bosses, seen the dead horses hauled off the ice roads. He understood the economics, how much it cost to maintain horse teams, how much production was lost when animals died, how the whole system groaned under limits that seemed impossible to exceed. And Lombard thought about tracks. The idea wasn't entirely new. Various inventors had experimented with continuous belt systems for agricultural equipment. A British inventor named John Boydell had patented a kind of endless track in the 1840s. But nobody had built a practical tracked vehicle. Nobody had figured out how to make the concept work in real conditions, on real terrain, hauling real loads. Lombard started sketching designs in the late 1890s. He built models, he tested concepts, he failed repeatedly, so learning from each failure, refining his ideas. The breakthrough came when he stopped thinking about tracks as replacements for wheels and started thinking about them as mechanical horses. Wheels push down on a single point. Tracks spread weight across a large area. A wheel that would sink in snow could be replaced by a track that would float on top of it. But tracks also provided something else: grip. On ice, wheels spun uselessly. Horses' hooves slipped and scrambled. But a track, a continuous belt of metal plates with cleats, could bite into ice and snow and haul against resistance that would defeat any wheel. In 1901, Lombard completed his first full-scale prototype. He applied for a patent on April 20th of that year. Patent number 674737 was granted on May 21st, 1901, for what Lombard called a traction engine. The machine was a monster, 20 tons of iron and steel and brass, a steam boiler at the front, burning wood, on generating enough pressure to drive a 2-cylinder engine. The engine connected to a massive drive sprocket at the rear, and around that sprocket ran the continuous track, metal plates linked together in an endless loop. powered by the sprocket, gripping the ground and pulling the machine forward. The front of the vehicle sat on steel skis like an enormous sleigh. The operator steered by turning the skis, pointing the machine where he wanted it to go while the tracks at the rear pushed it forward. It looked like something from a fever dream. A locomotive crossed with a sleigh, crossed with a tank that wouldn't exist for another 15 years. It belched smoke and steam and sparks. It made noise like the end of the world. It consumed 4 cords of wood per day just to keep the boiler running. And it worked. The first test run happened on a frozen road outside Waterville, and with Lombard himself at the controls. Witnesses said he drove the machine for 3 miles, turned it around, and drove it back, grinning the whole way. The tracks had gripped the ice, the skis had steered, the boiler had held, the engine had pulled. He'd built the first practical tracked vehicle in history. But here's what the Lombard log hauler looked like in operation, and here's why men both loved and feared it. The machines were massive. Later models weighed up to 25 tons, stretched 30 feet long, and carried boilers rated at 150 horsepower. The tracks themselves were engineering marvels, inch-thick steel plates linked by heavy chains, running on rollers that had to survive temperatures of 40 below zero without cracking. Each plate had cleats welded to its surface, metal teeth that bit into ice and snow. The cleats were replaceable because they wore down, but a good set would last a season if the ice roads were properly maintained. The boiler sat at the front, a massive cylinder of riveted steel that held steam at 180 pounds per square inch. At that pressure, a failure wasn't just dangerous, it was catastrophic. A boiler explosion could kill everyone within 100 feet and scatter debris for a quarter mile. The steam inside wasn't just hot, it was superheated, capable of stripping flesh from bone faster than any fire. A fireman named Thomas Burke ran the boiler on a Lombard operated by the Berlin Mills Company in New Hampshire. His job was to keep the fire burning, the water level steady, the pressure within safe limits. 12 hours a day, in a cab that was either freezing cold or blast furnace hot, depending on which way the wind blew, Burke shoveled wood into the firebox and watched the pressure gauge like his life depended on it. Because his life did depend on it. And so did the lives of everyone else on the machine. "You learn the sounds," Burke said later in an interview recorded in the 1940s. "The boiler talked to you. It hissed and it groaned and it pinged when the metal expanded. A good boiler had a rhythm. When the rhythm changed, something was wrong. You learned to hear trouble before you saw it. The engineer sat behind the boiler, operating the throttle and the steering mechanism. And steering a Lombard required muscle. The front skis were connected to the steering wheel by chains and gears, and turning them against resistance took real force. An engineer named Henry Bjornson, a Norwegian immigrant who ran Lombards for 8 winters, developed forearms like hams from fighting the steering mechanism through every curve. Bjornson could hear things in the engine that other men couldn't. A slight change in the rhythm of the exhaust. A variation in the sound of the tracks engaging the sprocket. He'd pull up and shut down for inspection when other engineers would have kept going. And more than once, he found problems. Cracked links, loose bolts, bearing failures developing that would have stranded the machine in the wilderness if they'd progressed. "The machine was a partner," Bjornson said. "You didn't just operate it, you listened to it. You felt what it felt. When the track grabbed wrong, you felt it in your hands. When the boiler ran hot, you felt it in the air. A good engineer was part of the machine, but the most dangerous job belonged to the sled tender." The Lombards didn't haul logs directly. They pulled trains of sleds, sometimes 8 or 10 sleds in a row, each one loaded with 15 or 20 tons of timber. The sled tender rode on the last sled in the train, operating a braking system that could slow the whole convoy on downgrades. If the brakes failed on a downgrade, the sleds would push the Lombard from behind, building speed until the whole train jackknifed or derailed. If the tender applied brakes too hard, the sleds could pile up, crushing logs and men together. If a coupling broke, the sleds behind the brake would race downhill on their own, unstoppable missiles of wood and iron. A sled tender named Michael Corrigan rode the brakes on a Lombard train in the winter of 1908 when a coupling snapped on a grade above the Kennebec River, and 3 sleds, 45 tons of logs, broke free and hurtled downhill. Corrigan was on the 4th sled, which stayed connected to the machine. He watched the runaways accelerate toward a curve that they'd never make. They didn't make it. The sleds left the road, scattered logs like matchsticks, and tumbled 200 feet into a ravine. One of the sleds disintegrated on impact. The other 2 came to rest against trees, shattered but recognizable. No one was on the runaway sleds except Corrigan's relief man, who'd been walking back from the front of the train. They found his body the next spring when the snow melted. He'd been caught by the first sled and carried into the ravine with the logs. The Lombard was a marvel. It was also a death trap. Let's talk about where these machines operated and what happened when things went wrong. The ice roads were the arteries of the logging industry. Built fresh each winter, they were engineering projects in their own right, carefully graded routes through the forest, cleared of stumps and obstacles, then flooded with water that froze into a surface slick enough to slide loaded sleds for miles. The roads had to be maintained constantly. A sprinkler, a sled-mounted water tank, would run ahead of the log trains, flooding the road surface with water that froze almost instantly in the cold air. A single night's work could ice a road smooth enough to haul on. A single day of warm weather could ruin it. The Lombards ran at night, mostly. The roads were firmest after sunset, when temperatures dropped and the ice hardened. The darkness added danger, trees looming out of the blackness, curves approaching with no warning, obstacles invisible until you were on top of them. But the better hauling conditions were worth the risk. A Lombard at night was something to see and hear from miles away. The smoke and steam rose white against the stars. The sparks from the smokestack drifted upward like fireflies, pinpoints of orange in the frozen dark. The noise, the chuffing of the engine, the grinding of the tracks, the creak of the sleds echoed through forests that were otherwise silent as death. But those sparks were dangerous. Every spark that left the smokestack was a potential fire. The forests were full of dry wood, slash piles from logging operations, dead trees that would ignite from a single ember. Winter fires were rare because of the snow cover, but they happened. And when they happened around a Lombard, the results could be catastrophic. A fire broke out on a road near the Allagash River in February of 1911. The cause was never determined, but the most likely explanation was sparks from a Lombard that had passed through hours earlier. The fire burned through a section of road, destroying the ice surface and stranding 3 Lombards and a dozen sled trains on the wrong side. It took 2 weeks to rebuild the road. During those 2 weeks, no logs moved. The company lost thousands of dollars in production, and the crews had to camp in the woods in February in Maine, while the work parties rebuilt what the fire had destroyed. The machines themselves were vulnerable to fire in a different way. The boiler sat surrounded by dry wood, the frame of the machine, the walls of the cab, the sleds behind. An overheated boiler, a misplaced spark from the firebox, shown a fuel load that caught when it shouldn't. Any of these could turn the machine into a bonfire. A Lombard operated by the St. John Lumber Company burned on a road near Presque Isle in 1914. The fire started in the cab, probably from a coal that rolled out of the firebox when the door was open for stoking. The engineer and fireman got clear, but the machine was a total loss. They stood in the snow and watched $20,000 of machinery, more than most of them would earn in a decade, burn to a skeleton of twisted iron. The boiler didn't explode, fortunately. The fire had vented the pressure before it built to dangerous levels. But the sight of that burning machine haunted the men who saw it. Fire was the enemy they couldn't fight. Water was too scarce, the snow too slow to smother the flames, the machines too valuable to watch, burn, but too dangerous to approach. But here's what happened when everything worked, and here's why the Lombard changed the industry. When a Lombard was running well, it could do the work of 60 horses, and that wasn't marketing. That was mathematics. A 10-horse team could haul 20 tons in good conditions. A Lombard could pull 8 sleds carrying 30 tons each, 240 tons total. Even accounting for stops, breakdowns, and the time needed for fuel and water, One Lombard could move as much timber in a day as 5 or 6 horse teams. But horses needed rest. Horses needed food hauled into the wilderness. Horses died and had to be replaced at $100 each. A Lombard needed wood and water, both of which were abundant in the Maine forests. A Lombard didn't need rest. You changed crews, not machines. A Lombard didn't die of exhaustion or exposure, though it might break down. And when a Lombard broke down, Alvin Lombard's company provided parts, and if needed, mechanics who could fix almost anything. The economics were overwhelming. The Great Northern Paper Company ran the numbers in 1904 and concluded that a single Lombard, operated for 5 winters, would save enough money in horse replacement costs alone to pay for itself twice over. When you added the increased production capacity, the savings multiplied. By 1910, Shell Lombards were operating across Maine and New Hampshire, with a few machines working in the upper Midwest and even California. The Lombard Manufacturing Company, based in Waterville, couldn't build them fast enough. Every timber company in the Snowbelt wanted one. The waiting list stretched months into the future. And here's what the men who ran them remembered decades later, when the machines were long gone and the horses were history. They remembered the cold, the bone-deep, a breath-stopping cold that no amount of clothing could defeat. Standing in the cab of a Lombard in January, with the firebox roaring on one side and the Maine winter howling on the other, was an experience in extremes. Your face froze while your back roasted. Your hands numbed while your arms sweated. They remembered the noise. A Lombard at full power was louder than anything most of them had ever heard. The engine hammering, the tracks grinding, the sleds groaning, on all of it echoing through frozen forests until you couldn't hear yourself think. Men who worked Lombards for years went partially deaf. They communicated in hand signals and shouts and eventually in a kind of telepathy born of long partnership. They remembered the fear. Every man who ran a Lombard knew someone who'd been killed by one. The machines were powerful and reliable by the standards of the time. But the standards of the time accepted a level of risk that would shut down any modern operation. A boiler explosion, a runaway sled train, a fall from the machine at the wrong moment, a fire that couldn't be controlled. Death was always possible, and sometimes it came. But they remembered something else too: pride. "We were the elite," said a former engineer named Clyde Hammond, interviewed in 1958 for a local history project. "The horse teamsters looked at us like we were gods. We ran the machines that did what horses couldn't. We kept them running when the cold should have frozen everything solid. We got the logs out." Hammond had run Lombards for 12 years, from 1906 to 1918. He'd seen 3 men killed by the machines and had nearly died himself when a boiler line burst and sprayed him with steam. He bore scars on his left arm that never faded. But when he talked about the Lombards, his eyes lit up. The machines had been something special. Working them had meant something. He'd been part of a brotherhood that did impossible work in impossible conditions, and he'd never forgotten it. Now let's talk about where Lombard's idea went after it left the Maine woods, and why Alvin Lombard died without the recognition he deserved. The continuous track was too important to stay in logging. As soon as the Lombard log haulers proved that tracks could work, that they could grip ice and snow, that they could haul massive loads, and that they could go where wheels couldn't, other inventors started paying attention. Benjamin Holt, a California tractor manufacturer, saw the potential for agriculture. The Central Valley of California had soil so soft that wheeled tractors sank to their axles. If tracks could float on snow, maybe they could float on mud. Holt visited Maine. He studied the Lombards. He went back to California and started experimenting with track tractors. By 1904, he had a working prototype. But there was a problem. Alvin Lombard held the patent on continuous tracks. Anyone who wanted to use the technology had to license it from him. Holt did license it. He paid Lombard for the right to use the track design, and he started manufacturing track tractors under his own name. In 1910, a company photographer watching one of Holt's machines crawl across a field supposedly said it moved like a caterpillar. The name stuck. Caterpillar Tractor Company. That's what Holt's firm eventually became. And every Caterpillar that ever rolled off an assembly line, every bulldozer, every excavator, every piece of tracked heavy equipment in the world traces its lineage back to Alvin Lombard's patent. But the military connection was even more profound. When World War I bogged down in the trenches, the British Army faced a problem that looked a lot like the Maine logging problem. Soft ground, heavy loads, wheels that couldn't cope. When the Western Front was a sea of mud, churned by shellfire and rain into a consistency that swallowed men and horses whole. The British looked at tracked vehicles. They looked at Holt tractors, which had been built under Lombard's licensed technology. They started experimenting with armored fighting vehicles that used tracks instead of wheels. The result was the tank. Like the first tanks that rolled into battle at the Somme in 1916 used continuous track systems derived directly from Alvin Lombard's 1901 patent. The machine that a Maine blacksmith invented to haul logs became the machine that broke the stalemate of the trenches. Lombard himself had nothing to do with the military application. He was still in Waterville, still running his manufacturing company, still building log haulers and other equipment for the timber industry. The world was using his idea to reshape warfare, and he was focused on getting logs to the mills. He received licensing fees. He wasn't cheated exactly. But the scale of what his invention had enabled dwarfed anything he could have imagined when he built that first prototype in 1901. Caterpillar became a global giant. Tanks became the dominant weapon of modern land warfare. And Alvin Orlando Lombard remained a small-time manufacturer in central Maine, known locally, forgotten nationally. When Lombard died in 1937, at the age of 81, the obituaries mentioned his log haulers. A few noted that he'd invented the continuous track. None of them grasped the full significance of what he'd done. The machines that won World War I, the tractors that built the modern world, the bulldozers that carved highways across continents, all of them carried DNA from that first Lombard log hauler. But Lombard's name faded. Holt's name and the Caterpillar brand became synonymous with tracked vehicles. The inventor was forgotten. The invention conquered the world. Let me tell you about what happened to the machines themselves. The Lombards had a problem that no amount of engineering could solve. They were built for a world that was disappearing. Gasoline engines got better, trucks got more capable, roads got paved. The logging industry that had depended on ice roads and winter hauling began transitioning to year-round operations, using trucks that could go where the Lombards couldn't. By the 1920s, the writing was on the wall. The Lombard Manufacturing Company built fewer and fewer log haulers each year. The last one rolled out of the Waterville shop in 1917. After that, the company focused on parts and service for existing machines, keeping the fleet running as long as possible. But one by one, until the Lombards went silent. Companies retired them, replaced them with trucks, scrapped them for parts. The massive machines that had dominated the ice roads for 2 decades became relics of a vanishing era. In the end, only 83 Lombard log haulers were ever built. Of those, a handful survive. The Maine State Museum in Augusta has one, a beautifully restored example that occasionally operates for demonstrations. Belching smoke and grinding forward on tracks that still work after more than a century. The machine was built in 1910 and worked in the Maine woods until 1929, when it was retired and eventually donated to the museum. The Lumberman's Museum in Patton, Maine has another, less complete, but still impressive. The Owl's Head Transportation Museum has parts and documentation. A few private collectors have machines in various states of repair. If you stand next to a surviving Lombard, the scale hits you first. These were not small machines. 25 feet long, 10 feet wide, taller than a man at the cab. The tracks alone weigh hundreds of pounds per section. Massive links of iron designed to grip ice that would have defeated any other vehicle on Earth. The second thing that hits you is the silence. These machines were never quiet in life. They roared and hammered and ground their way through the forest. But now they sit motionless, cold iron that hasn't moved in decades, Monuments to an industry and an era that exists now only in photographs and memories. And here's what we owe to Alvin Lombard, and here's what we've lost, and here's why a blacksmith from Waterville deserves to be remembered. Every tracked vehicle in the world carries Lombard's idea. The tanks that roll through battlefields, the bulldozers that clear construction sites, the excavators that dig foundations, the combines that harvest grain, the snowcats that groom ski slopes, right? The military vehicles that traverse deserts and jungles and every terrain that wheels can't handle. All of them use continuous tracks. All of them trace back to patent 674-737, granted to Alvin Orlando Lombard on May 21st, 1901. The engineers who refined the technology deserve credit. Benjamin Holt made tracks practical for agriculture. The British Army adapted them for warfare. Caterpillar turned them into a global industry. Thousands of designers and mechanics and operators contributed improvements that made tracked vehicles what they are today. But the original insight that a continuous belt of metal plates could grip surfaces that defeated wheels, could spread weight across areas that would swallow traditional vehicles, could pull loads that no other technology could move. That insight belonged to a blacksmith watching horses die in the Maine winter. Lombard saw a problem. He imagined a solution. He built it with his own hands, in his own shop, using skills he'd taught himself. And the solution worked. We've gained so much since then. We've gained tracked vehicles that can go anywhere, do anything, build or destroy on scales that would have astonished Lombard. We've gained efficiency and power and capability that his first prototype only hinted at. But we've lost something too. We've lost the era of the generalist inventor, the man who could see a problem, imagine a solution, and build it himself without teams of specialists or corporate backing or university credentials. Lombard wasn't an engineer by training. He was a problem solver by instinct. He watched horses die. He thought about it. He built something better, and the something better changed the world. We've also lost the machines themselves mostly. 83 built, fewer than 10 surviving. The monsters that hauled 300 tons through blizzards are now museum pieces, relics of a logging industry that doesn't exist anymore. The ice roads are gone. The horse teams are gone. The bunkhouses where men slept 3 high in bunks that smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, gone. The whole world of Maine winter logging, with its brutal cold and its casual death and its impossible productivity, gone. The Lombards were part of that world. They were the most impressive part, the most powerful part, and the part that replaced 60 horses and never got tired and kept hauling through nights so cold that steam froze before it hit the ground. Here's to Alvin Orlando Lombard, the blacksmith who invented the tracked vehicle in a shop in Waterville, who solved a problem that had killed thousands of horses, who created technology that would reshape warfare and construction and agriculture, and who died without the recognition he deserved. Here's to the engineers and firemen who ran the machines, the men who learned to hear trouble in the rhythm of an engine, who felt the mountain through the steering mechanism, who kept 20 tons of iron and steel and brass moving through conditions that would have stopped any other vehicle in existence. Here's to the sled tenders who rode the brakes, who trusted their lives to couplings and chains, who watched for runaway sleds, who knew that a single failure meant death in a ravine miles from help. Here's to the mechanics who kept the machines running, who fabricated parts in the field, who welded cracked frames in temperatures that made metal brittle, who understood the Lombards well enough to nurse them through winters that destroyed lesser equipment. Here's to the men who died, crushed by loads, burned by fires, frozen in breakdowns, killed by boilers that failed, or tracks that snapped, or accidents that no one could have predicted. The Lombards are silent now. The Maine State Museum runs theirs once in a while, and the sound echoes across the grounds like thunder from another century. People gather to watch, to photograph, to marvel at a machine that seems impossible, too big, too loud, too aggressive for the quiet world we live in now. But for a few moments, when the boiler is fired and the steam is up and the tracks begin to move, you can hear what the men of the ice roads heard, the chuffing of the engine, the grinding of the metal plates, the creak of the frame as 20 tons of history lurches into motion. The ghosts ride again. The horses they replaced are long gone. Generations of them turned to dust in fields where they were buried. But the machine that replaced them, the machine that one blacksmith built because he believed there had to be a better way, still moves. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are more forgotten inventors to remember, more machines that shaped the world and then disappeared into history, more names that deserve to be spoken by people who understand what they accomplished. Alvin Orlando Lombard invented the tracked vehicle. Every tank, every bulldozer, every caterpillar owes him something. And until today, you probably never heard his name. Now you have. Remember it. The next time you see a bulldozer on a construction site, the next time you watch footage of a tank rolling across a battlefield, the next time you encounter any vehicle running on continuous tracks, think of a blacksmith shop in Waterville, Maine. Think of horses dying in the snow. Think of a man who watched them die and decided to build something better. He did build something better, and the world has never been the same.